Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Atkinson, and I am the Director of Programs and Partnerships for the Future of Public Safety Initiative here at John Jay College. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the third of 6 workshops for the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge, which we are proud to host with our partners at Cities United and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and with support from the Obama Foundation's My Brother's Keeper Alliance. Before we dive into the program, I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. And I will also note that the views expressed here are those of the presenters individually, not the Obama Foundation, John Jay College, or our partner organizations. We invite you to enter any questions into the Q&A box throughout the conversation, and we'll reserve time at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. For those who are not familiar with the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge, this pledge invites local officials to commit to investing in at least one of 3 key public safety strategies: empowering communities to address violence, investing in the creation or sustainability of off-ramps from the criminal legal system, and finally, investing in prevention and restorative strategies that heal communities. Please visit the pledge website that will be dropped into the chat to stay up to date on our upcoming workshop schedule and additional resources related to the pledge. The Reimagine Public Safety Pledge is a core program of John Jay's Future of Public Safety Initiative that was launched in the fall of 2021 under the direction and guidance of John Jay College President Carol V. Mason and John Jay's Vice President of Justice Initiatives, Erica Bond. More information about the initiative can be found at the link that's also provided in the chat. And finally, I'd like to thank some of our partners who have been instrumental in supporting this pledge: Adrian Wilson, Beverly Brooks, Jihad Dixon, and the My Brother's Keeper Alliance team, Anthony Smith and the Cities United team, Bree Spencer and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights team, and John Jay's Offices of External Affairs and Institutional Advancement. At this time, I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's conversation, Bree Spencer. Bree serves as the Senior Program Director of Justice Reform at the Leadership Conference, a 74-year-old coalition of civil rights organizations that works to build an America as good as its ideals. Before joining the Leadership Conference, Bree was the Director of Evaluation and Technical Assistance at Safe and Sound in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where she created, implemented, and managed a revenue-generating technical assistance program for community-engaged public safety solutions. In addition to working at the Leadership Conference, Bree currently serves as the Commissioner on Milwaukee's Fire and Police Civilian Oversight Board. Bree has her MPA from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. And Bree, I'll now turn it over to you to introduce our speakers. And as they're introduced, I'll be dropping a link to their full bios in the chat.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. We're excited you're here today. I am really grateful for this opportunity to facilitate this discussion with such an awesome panel who know a lot about the topic of alternative first response. So I'm going to introduce folks now, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Mayor Cassie Franklin from Everett, Washington is joining us. She was one of the first, she's the mayor of one of the first communities to join the Reimagine Public Safety Pledge. Welcome. Tahir Duckett, Executive Director of the Georgetown Law Center for Innovations in Community Safety, which we were from here on out referred to as KICS. So that's what we're talking about. Hi, Tahir. Steve Miccio, he is the CEO of People USA. Did I get it right, Steve? All right, good. Welcome, so glad you're here. And Joshua Reeves, an alternative first response consultant and co-founder of the awesome Albuquerque Community Safety Department. Hi, Joshua. All right, so we're just gonna get right into it. I have some questions, but it's also meant to be kind of a discussion. So if any one of the people I ask a question to, if you of the other panelists have thoughts or things you wanna add on, please feel free to do so, and we'll keep it moving. So as a born and raised in Washington State, was really excited to see a Washington mayor on the panel, and we'll go to you first, Mayor Franklin. So some of Everett's initial alternative response initiatives began in 2015 with the implementation of community outreach and enforcement teams, which was a co-response model that partners police officers with social workers. Can you share an overview of the model and what led to the decision to incorporate a co-response approach into Everett's public safety response?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Bree. And thanks. Happy to be here and talk about the work that we're doing in Everett to address some of the challenges that we're seeing. And this is an important part of that work. You know, looking back at our city, that about a decade ago, that was one of the first major steps forward in addressing kind of the safety challenges. We previous mayor put together a streets initiative, a task force made up of community members to look at the street level social issues, and they brought a number of recommendations, including co-response. And this is rather common now, but it was really cutting edge about a decade ago, and it was our first foray into alternative response. It's a balanced approach of adding social workers to our police department team that then can proactively go out and do the work of connecting with people rather than just responding to a call for service. They proactively go out and connect with people who are struggling on our streets. They either, can use the officers there to kind of help them follow up on accountability. But our social workers really connect them to services, connect them to housing, connect them to the resources, meals, whatever they need, treatment. But what we're been excited to do is expand that model now into social workers embedded in our fire department, our library department, that can really now go out on their own and help people in the community. They're not just tied to police, or that we've created a hub within our library system where people can come and access services open 6 days a week. And it's really helping us, utilize 911 more for emergency services, but we can follow up. Our fire teams can refer people to our social workers now to help people ongoing with their case management needs.
Thank you. I know we're gonna talk to you more, and I'm excited to hear even more about that. Um, Joshua, let's go to you. So as one of the first members of the Albuquerque Community Safety Department, you helped to develop the office's infrastructure, including top to bottom, right? Developing the strategic plan and identifying metrics to collect and analyze. As a consultant, you now support communities across the country preparing to stand up alternative response teams. So my question for you, it's kind of a big one, is where, what were the key decision points when deciding whether to create a standalone cabinet level department or incorporate these programs as initiatives within an existing public safety department, or outsourcing the services to an external partner?
Thank you so much for the question. And I'm also honored to be here with these amazing panelists. Yeah, I think this was a really big component that made Albuquerque unique. Sort of the context for what were the needs of our community. The police department for almost a decade now has been under a DOJ consent decree related to their response to homelessness and mental health issues. So sort of myriad types of issues where reform needed to happen. The previous mayor and Mayor Keller both had different initiatives to try to figure out how can we sort of pilot these ideas of not having police respond to everything. So they did start with a co-response model of having external clinicians embedded with CIT trained officers. So like that happened for a couple of years before the creation of ACS. And then also they tried pilots of using the Metro Security Division. Can they do wellness checks and different types of things? So they were testing this out. And then with the murder of George Floyd, that was sort of a catalyst, and calls for drastic change happened in Albuquerque. And so thinking about what was the community wanting, they wanted something large, something permanent. And while we explored other models, of course, Cahoots' model, can we outsource to other clinicians, or to other clinics or something like that? Those are viable in certain communities, but for us, the thought was, if we want something as lasting and as permanent as police and fire departments, we need to make it as equivalent to police and fire departments. So by creating a standalone department where the director is the equivalent of the chiefs of police and fire, it would allow for us to develop our own culture, to then have, unionization, to have flexibility to add programs so that the vision doesn't just say with we have this one type of responder that does this specific function. the department is able to incorporate things like violence intervention programs, or have case managers, or have co-response and alternative response, all these different components, that growth and permanency is allowed by having a department that can be flexible with general funds, as opposed to limiting scope within like an RFP going to a singular organization. I think that was sort of the decision making behind creating a cabinet level department.
Yeah, that makes sense. I suspect that there'll be some questions when we get to the Q&A around sustainability and how that works with municipal budgeting, identifying new or where you got the funds from to stand up a department of its own. So looking forward to that. Thank you. Steve, let's go to you next. One of the unique features of People USA is its peer-led model, meaning people with lived experience develop and implement its programming. When you joined People USA as CEO in 1999, you helped expand the organization's role beyond its initial advocacy work and into service delivery. So the question I have for you is kind of a two-parter. One is, what was the driver for expanding into service delivery? And secondly, why is it important to have people with lived experience included in the development of alternative response models?
Sure, and thank you. Nice to be here. Well, when I first started at People, it was just an advocacy organization. We didn't really have any services. We had some, recreational grants. We had some multicultural grants. I don't even know what they are, but there's these different types of grants that were more like helping people have a safe haven or a safe place to go once they were released from a psychiatric center. And as they were closing psychiatric centers in New York, we noticed the need for more advocacy, but then I also noted big gaps in the service system, in the delivery of service in our communities. And I can only throw rocks at a system for so long before I become responsible as a concerned citizen to say, we can do better, we can make this better. And if I don't have everyone's ear and everyone's will to change the system, why don't I create the change in the system? And that's what I started doing, was developing respite houses. As I call them, they were crisis diversion houses. Instead of going to a hospital, why couldn't somebody come to a really nice bed and breakfast like house in a crisis and have 24-hour peer support to say, hey, we can get you through this, and we can offer tools and valuable information on how to look at your crisis differently and how to live differently in your quality of life. And so that's what I started doing. I started also putting people with lived experience in emergency rooms, because those are one of the worst places for anybody to go, whether you're chronically normal or having substance use or mental health issues. It doesn't matter. They're just not great places to go to, because they can be very traumatic. And for the behavioral health world, it's very traumatic, because the staff are, just feel overburdened. They feel that that's not where they should be. It's just a big national and worldwide, issue that we've been having with emergency rooms for years. And so having a peer, having someone in the emergency room say, I'm really glad you're here and I'm going to help you through this process. And here's what we're about to go through together if you want me to go through it with you, just made sense. So a lot of the work that I created wasn't necessarily trailblazing, although it may have been called that. It was really common sense. And how do you treat people with dignity and respect when they're having a hard time? And that was the whole purpose behind everything I was doing in all the different programs. And we have over 50 programs now that we provide in communities in New York State. And they're all based on what's missing, what can we fill it with, and how can we get there, and how can we make people's lives better. And so that was important. The peer part of it is, I myself am someone with lived experience, and I went through that process of being hospitalized, being scared to death by that hospitalization, living on these, with these medications that were just not the healthiest for me. However, they did kind of tend to address one area of my life in my brain. They didn't address my whole physical wellness. And so I struggled with that. And so I was one of those people that had to have that experience to understand what it was like. And then when I finally found other people that had bipolar disorder and were living with it and living productive lives, I found out I wasn't alone. And when I found out I wasn't alone, That's what sparked my hope and my self-determination for recovery. And that's what I worked from. So having people in your services with lived experience can be the spark of hope, can be the self-determination that people need, can be the permission to recover for others. And that's where I think the lived experience is so important.
Thank you so much. That's such an important insight. Like, no one knows what it's like unless you've actually been through it, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I really love about this topic and about the application and the creativity that we see applied in lots of different places to build up alternative first response is how absolutely, really objectively practical it is. It really, like you said, common sense. And I think there's a lot of common sense in this type of approach that we kind of see missing, frankly, in the status quo without it.
Mm.
So sort of on that note, and we're kind of ripping through the questions, but then we're going to have a discussion. So I think that'll be really good. You all bring a lot of important and very sort of specific insights that I think will work really beautifully together. So we know it's important. I think everybody who's on this call is probably invested in the idea that it's important, or is at least curious to learn more. Tahir, let's talk about, we've heard the good things. Let's talk about some of the challenges. So KICS partners and works with agencies and communities across the country on standing up or continuing to invest in alternative first response models. What are some of the challenges you've observed with sustaining these models?
Thanks for the question, and it's great to be with all of these really incredible folks. Here at KICS, we've been working with alternative response organizations across the nation for the past 4 years, as several of them have gone from small pilots or experimental programs to programs more deeply rooted in the fabric of their communities. Last year, in partnership with NYU Law's Policing Project, we hosted a first of its kind conference here at Georgetown, bringing together practitioners, community members, academics, advocates, funders, to really work through some of the rapid developments in the field, which existed before the murder of George Floyd, but has really exploded since then. And I'll actually drop our conference report into the chat, which has some of our findings from that convening. There are a few things that we have seen organizations tell us over the course of the last few years. The first is it may make sense to start small, but don't stay small. And when I say don't stay small, it's not really necessarily about numbers, but it is about the sort of breadth of the kinds of work that non-police response can do. It might make sense in a lot of places to start with a few call types and sort of build from there. What we don't want is for folks to feel satisfied that we're going to respond to really a tiny sliver of calls that are just the very, very safest, and there's 0% chance that anything could ever go wrong. And what you do when you house yourself like that is you lose the opportunity to really expand the promise of this work. And so that's the first thing. The second thing that I would say is you have to fund it like you want it to succeed. There are certainly places where the pilots, the experiments have started with this idea that, okay, we can throw a little bit of money at this problem and then let's see what happens. But the reality is the number of calls that could be responded to by non-police responders, it's really a significant number. And so if you want to actually see results, you have to see really significant investment. That being said, investment alone isn't enough. One of the major problems that I continuously see across the country is that the workforce to staff these responder positions doesn't necessarily exist. I remember just after the murder of George Floyd, you had a lot of people, advocates across the country, saying, oh, we need mental health workers to respond to X, Y, and Z types of calls, which may be right. But which mental health workers specifically are we talking about? Because we don't exactly have a glut of mental health workers nationwide that are out of work, that are looking for, looking to be 24/7 responders necessarily. And so we really need to take a step back and think systemically about how to build this workforce. And by the way, when we say mental health workers, are we talking all about licensed clinical social workers or psychologists? Or are we actually just talking about the kinds of support that we hope that people will actually provide? And so that's part of that building the workforce. It's about not narrowing the workforce to, such a tiny sliver of the potential of potentially qualified applicants that you end up not actually being able to fill the vans that need to go out and respond to the calls. Which we have a lot of thoughts about how to start to build that workforce, and we can maybe get into that later if we want to, but at the very top of the list, it's something that we need to invest in and need to invest in from a systemic sort of perspective. I'll say two more things. One is that alternative response has to be a part of a larger continuum of care. Alternative response are responders. They don't make up the entire continuum. And if we are hoping that alternative responders are going to solve our problems with chronic homelessness, or solve our problems with, suicidal ideation, if we don't actually have other parts of the system that we invest in with the same sort of gusto, or maybe with more gusto, then we're going to end up in a situation where, and I've gotten these calls from program directors where they say, my policymakers are looking at me and saying, hey, we're still dealing with tent cities. I thought you guys were going to get rid of this. It's like, that's not what this is. This is not going to do that on its own. And then the last thing that I'll say is that we have to be careful not to replicate the same systems of oppression that have shown up elsewhere. There's an instinct, I think, among a lot of folks who have seen the kind of policing harm that's shown up in our streets and in our cities, and that is targeted Black and brown communities in particular, that has targeted people suffering from mental illness. But it's not enough to say not them, right? We have to do a little bit better and recognizing that the same sorts of white supremacy, ableism, heteropatriarchy, all of these things that show up in policing, they can show up in our other systems. They can show up in social work, right? In fact, there's a lot of people who write a lot about how those systems do show up in social work and how there's a lot of harm that comes from that. And so it can't be enough to say, oh, I don't want this to be a police response and that's going to fix our problem. We have to be very, very vigilant to make sure that the systems that we're building aren't rooted and vulnerable to those same systems of oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you shouted out the conference from last year, because I think it was really an exceptional convening. And one of the big things I took away from that convening was how important it is to send the right response at the right time. And I think what you're enumerating is all the different aspects and considerations that go into what is a right response and what is the right time to send it. And I think I really appreciate in particular you naming the importance of the intentionality with which we need to set up new systems so they do not just look like what we had before. In particular, like the need for an affirmative safety agenda. Like we can't just think of it in the negative. It has to be a positive thing that we're building out with real substance and real framework to allow it to sustain and actually help people in the way that we're envisioning. I'm wondering, Steve, if we could go back to you quickly on this topic of training. And I think like let's maybe take a beat and talk about that, and to hear if you have a response or things to add to what Steve says. But what do you think from your angle, Steve, is important for the training and professional development necessary to maintain a qualified and prepared like workforce in this space?
Yeah, we do a lot of training, but one of I think the major things is that we change the lens of who we serve, and that is being open to our community and understanding our community in a very different way. Instead of looking at it from an illness-based approach to people, we look at it a wellness-based approach, but also we want to seek to understand. We want to understand who's in front of us, what are they dealing with, what has happened to them, not what's wrong with them. And have that patience and resiliency to understand that there is strength in everybody you serve. You just have to sometimes look a little deeper for that strength. And when you can find that, you can work with those individuals in a much better way. So we do a lot of the, the traditional, the DEI training, the listening skills training, motivational interview training, but we do take it deeper because we are people with lived experience, and we know all of us, in our organization at different times have been in really challenging places. And so we developed a lot of that training ourselves. And how do we deal with that? How do we, when we're dealing with somebody that is, we use the word psychosis or, alternative states or whatever. How do we address that? How do we deal with that? And so we practice that in our training, and we work through it and we understand it. And so again, you may not build trust in that first visit if you're a mobile team or you're just seeing someone for the first time, but you are going to build it if you build a trusting, trauma-informed engagement that says, okay, I know I'm here screaming at you. I'm really angry. I'm pissed off at the world, but you're listening to me, and you're actually not you're not reacting, you're responding. And so I'm getting a different vibe from you when I'm acting out, because I expect you to just call the police and have me put in jail or have me brought to the hospital, but you're not doing that. Why aren't you doing that? So it confuses people, but it's a nice disruption in their life because it does start to build the trust. That's where the resiliency comes in to say they might come here, or we might have to visit them 10, 15, 20 times before we get anywhere with this. But we're going to do it with a smile and dignity and respect every time we do it. So that training also lends to supporting your staff, making sure that your supports are there, because this is really hard work. And when you can provide that support for your staff and you can give them outlets to, freedom to speak, freedom to decompress, freedom to do what they need to do so that they can do their jobs well. And that's where I think where lived experience helps us too, is that we had to go through a lot to recover. And it wasn't just the pill and the psychiatrist and the therapist that did it. It was a lot of different things. So we talk about that in our training, and we bring that to light so that when we're working with folks in our communities, we have that patience and we can provide that patience and that compassion, for everybody.
That's incredible. I have 1,000 questions, but I'm moderating. I'm not. So let me Tahir, Mayor Franklin, Joshua, do you all have anything you'd like to add? Mayor?
Yeah, I'll just jump on the training a little bit. I think everything that you just highlighted, Steve, that is necessary for the training of these alternative response teams, it's also necessary for all of us to be training our law enforcement teams with those same skills. I think it takes a long time to build up a alternative response program. We're still building ours. And I think ensuring that the law enforcement and all your first responders, your fire as well, have been trained in mental health first aid, de-escalation, trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, so that their approach is that it's similar to what the alternative response team's approach is. And I think that is key, because each one of these teams is going to interact with those individuals on our streets, and we want that experience to be positive, accepting, we are listening, we see you, regardless of which team is interacting with them that day.
Thank you.
If I may also
Oh yeah, Joshua, please
jump in there. I think something Tahir talked about, this idea of the workforce being limited. One of the problems we often hear in communities is like, we can't hire officers, right? Like that's a big problem. Like in Albuquerque, we can't fill all these spots. So needing a larger public safety presence in general, this is one of those gaps where an alternative response program can fit, because perhaps there are people who might not necessarily be interested in being police officers, but this is a role that there is interest in. And I think one of the strengths of the program in Albuquerque is that we also recognize there is a limited amount of licensed clinicians in the state. There's definitely a shortage of that. But when we looked at what are the needs that we have here, and when one of the problems is like, yes, there are those acute mental health crises where you need someone with a license to might have to do an involuntary hospitalization. But there's a huge volume of calls that do not need a law enforcement presence, that just need someone to triage, to assess the situation, to do resource navigation. And those skills do not necessarily require licensure to do that. So we have, tiers of responders. We have an entry-level community responder who helps a lot with those who are unsheltered, people who might just need resource navigation, and then behavioral health responders who, again, don't necessarily need to be licensed if they're not having to do involuntary hospitalizations. And so if you can sort of expand your idea of who is the right response in a way, by providing training, getting people with the right mindset of like, that's the culture, setting the culture of we are here to understand what the underlying need is and find the right person, connect you to the long-term care that you need. I think if you kind of expand it that way, you can find other sources for your workforce, which also tend to be less expensive because they don't have the clinical background that's going to have a higher rate. So I think there's a lot of practical areas there where you can think about meeting the larger public safety need.
Tahir, did you have anything to add for that one?
No, I mean, I think my colleagues really spoke well to it. It is, the one of the things that I find really kind of exciting about this moment is that we can, really build something and build the culture around that thing from scratch here, right? And I mean, and Josh talked about this specifically with regards to ACS, and the sort of importance of culture there. But we have the opportunity as we kind of build this new workforce, this newly expanded workforce, to really set expectations in terms of, as Steve was mentioning, how we actually treat the folks that we're working with. And it's also about how we treat the people who are doing the work. One of the things that I do want to flag is that you see so much trauma fatigue in law enforcement, and the downsides to that for people on the street are devastating. They aren't going to be the only ones who experience trauma fatigue, right? The human brain is just not necessarily designed to see all of the stuff that we end up throwing at first responders. So what does it actually look like for us to build a profession that doesn't even necessarily have to be resilient to it, but to where the entire career pathways are built with an understanding of how do we ensure that people can do this work and do it well and do it in a way that's healthy, both for them and for the folks that they're actually encountering on an everyday basis. And I don't think that we have all the answers to that yet, but I would love to see us really focusing on building it, because it's so hard to change directions once the thing is built, once the culture is established. I mean, that's something that we've seen in policing, right? Anybody who's worked in police reform will tell you that shifting police culture is one of the most challenging things to try to do over time. And so I don't want us to be looking back 50 years from now and wishing that we had spent a little bit more time focusing on what is the culture of these new responders. What's that going to look like?
Whew. No, I'm with you. I don't want that either. So I think that this is a really good and important time in our country to be having that discussion, because a lot of places aren't that far along yet with this programming. So to circle back, I want to go back to Mayor Franklin and ask this before we shift to the Q&A, because I think this is, I'm sure for other mayors on the call, this is very forefront in their minds. Everett recently received funding from the state Senate to create a new alternative response team. How are you able to gain buy-in at the state level to invest, as we've been talking about, which is a critical piece of these being successful in your alternative program?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Bree. And, I'm very lucky to be in Washington State and have a great delegation here in the state at a federal level, and also great state representatives that understand their communities well. But I do want to say that we made it a priority to educate our state legislature on the experience that we were having as a city in the post George Floyd world, and increased behavioral health crisis that we see on our streets, and just what we are seeing. And so we've spent a lot of time advocating. We were joined in some of those advocacy works, but with former Governor Christina Gregoire, who was working as part of an organization trying to see, like, what are the unique challenges that some major cities are experiencing in this safety space, and what can we do to change the trajectory. And I joined founded a coalition of mayors across the county to advocate for resources needed to the state delegation. And I think those are really effective. Having your delegation here frequently, not just from one mayor, but from mayors altogether, having the former governor engaged, allowed us to really help tell the story. And certainly people with lived experience, as we were talking about earlier, are the best spokespeople. They also might be the solution to our workforce challenge. I do think that they are critical in the response, but we were able to advocate to get not only $500,000 from the state for a pilot emergency or a mobile opioid treatment team that is made up of hospital ER doctors, our social workers, and other health providers to proactively be in this space. But also we're able to advocate to the federal delegation for $4.5 million to create an alternative response. So we've got that grant from Senator Murray. And so the senator was invited here. She came and met a number of times with my team and our first responders, and was just hearing in the hospital, hearing what was happening in our community and just the great need. And I think together those forces were able to come together, and we could zero our energies and focus and get that funding to kick this off. We're also using opioid treatment dollars that are coming to many states that were involved in that lawsuit. And ARPA to kind of kick things off. And so now with these bigger allotments of funding, we can really create that robust alternative response that we've been wanting, that's independent from our other our embedded program, and to be in that space. So I think those early advocacy efforts and gathering the voices across beyond our city boundaries was really important in helping our state understand the urgency of this and how much we need this.
I really appreciate you laying that out. I think advocacy is such a huge piece, and that's a lot of times for the general public parts that kind of go unseen. It's a lot of the hidden work in the mix here. And listen, the building blocks of this are relational, right? It's organizing, it's connecting humans to humans. That's also what the response is for, to be more humane and more engaged with our community members. Wondering, if anybody has anything they want to add on to that, not necessarily the state buy-in of Washington State, but where you've seen success and how you've seen success build in sustainable funding. I'm kind of looking at you, Joshua, but you can't tell because we're on Zoom.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think Albuquerque, we were definitely fortunate that there was just the political will necessary to push city councilors to use general funds for this, and sort of we took a proof of concept approach. So our first year budget was $1.2 million, which seems like a large investment, but it's not that many people when you consider how expensive vehicles are, radios, all of those things. But after showing that this could be successful and we had positive outcomes, it is about networking, community advocacy, leveraging your partners, your community advocates to then like press community or press the decision makers. This is something we want to continue investing in. And I know now in Albuquerque, the current budget for ACS is $17 million, but it's grown year after year to meet particular goals. So you set a goal of like, all right, we are going to provide Monday through Friday 8 to 5 service. Okay, now we want to get, add a shift. It's going to cost this much money. We want to get to 24/7. It's going to cost this much money. And by setting very clear metrics, you can ask for something specific and have your community advocates then say, we want 24/7 coverage, and I know exactly how much that's going to cost. We can find funding for that. And then, as the Mayor Franklin was pointing out, finding grants and soft money to launch the like capital expenditures. That's how ECS was able to get a headquarters built, was with geo bond funding, getting state funding for systems that you need implemented. So kind of thinking about how can we leverage soft money for one-time expenditures and use community advocacy to incrementally, with like sustainable goals in mind, hard funding for our continuous operations.
All right, thank you, Joshua. So I'm going to pivot now back to Rebecca and hand it over.
Yes, thank you for all of the questions that have been coming in, and thank you so much for this rich conversation. Mayor Franklin, there's a question that came in that I actually would like to direct to you. And it says, like, when you suggest or when someone suggests alternative responses, it can seemingly be seen, as a less than response. So how do you address community and law enforcement perspectives and just shift the way people are thinking and framing this?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's absolutely not a less than, it's in addition to, right? We still have our law enforcement department. We need them to respond to urgent calls for service. We have our first responders and our fire and EMS. Alternative responses is gearing that response, just like when you call 911 and you're calling for there's somebody's having a heart attack. Our EMS is the right team to go out to that. Somebody is being burglarized, our police unit is the right to go out to that. But if somebody is having a behavioral health crisis, there's probably a better suited team. And so I think it's not a less than, it's just an addition to. And one of the things that I think was hard for me in advocating for this and explaining it, not only to our city council, but our delegation, everything, is it's going to cost us more initially. This is not saving us money on 911 calls. We still have all those 911 calls. This is now a different team that is going to help us go out and respond to a certain number of calls. And perhaps over time, we can reduce the number of 911 responses because of that. But initially, it's an investment in the health and well-being of the community. And so it's not a less than, it is absolutely, it's an appropriate kind of, response for the crisis that is happening, but it is in addition to 911 response.
Joshua, I think these two questions that came in, I can direct at you because they are really asking more about kind of the practical pieces of implementation. So one is, and I'm asking you, but this will be open to all the panelists, how do you address liability concerns?
Oh, that's a great question. And we definitely struggled with that because we did not have, our responders were not licensed clinicians. And so that was a big debate that happened for a while. And I think that's one of the pros to having an organization or having this type of program under the city directly, because the city has its own like liability and insurance and claims process. It protects responders and makes them feel more comfortable going to this because they're part of the larger umbrella. And it is sort of a gray legal zone, and in full transparency, a lot of laws and regulations only occur in response to lawsuits. And so far, knock on wood, right? Like there hasn't been something like that has happened. And so it's sort of empowering our responders by assuring like you are covered under this larger entity. So you personally are protected. We, the city, are taking on the liability. But the way that we reframe it is the police department has tens of millions of dollars of budget specifically for getting sued. So if we reframe it of how many instances of use of force issues or whatever there might be that we can prevent is going to save the city money from potential police lawsuits. So in the off chance that we will eventually get sued once or twice, how many police lawsuits, which are probably more expensive, did we save the city? So that's sort of the way to reframe the conversation in a sense.
I appreciate that. And then another question about implementation, and maybe Tahir, since you've done some work nationally and understand the national landscape, you can speak to this as well. When you're thinking about funding these offices, are you able to bill or be reimbursed by Medicaid?
Whew, I would actually kick that back. Josh is definitely going to be a better person to answer that than I am, and maybe Mayor Franklin. I know that the answer to that is complicated. It depends. But yeah, I don't know, Josh. So somebody else take this one.
I know at least from our end, like we're not there yet. That is the next step that ACS, and I can't speak for them, but that is where we're going. And the big thing to look at is transports. Like that's one of the major value adds is, you know, police have limitations in what they can transport to as well as ambulances. And so saying that we can transport to service providers and being able to bill Medicaid, that's going to be the key. I think the actual mobile visits themselves, that's going to be very challenging to bill for, but the transports, that's probably going to be the biggest area of opportunity to bill for Medicaid.
If I can just add, New York, we can Medicaid bill now, which is pretty cool. I did not want to become a Medicaid provider, but when they started looking at that in the state level and started saying they were going to Medicaid bill for the mobile services, we got involved, and I brought in trainers where I said, treat me like a third grader because I really don't like Medicaid and I want to be able to do it like a third grader so I can focus very little on my documentation, but focus a lot on the people we serve. And we went through that process and it's been working. The other is that when you do evidence, you know, there's evidence-based practices, but there's practice-based evidence. And we did create the respite model here in New York. And also we created, didn't even create it, but we opened a crisis stabilization centers, and we're opening more now. And they weren't licensed and they weren't Medicaid billable or anything like that. In 2017, we opened the first stabilization center. It is now licensed in Medicaid billable and sustainable. But we had to do it originally with county dollars and legislative dollars. And now we're able to now move it into a Medicaid model where it is sustainable. And the same thing is happening with the respites too. So we're seeing the needle move based on the outcomes and the work that we're all doing. And the state is recognizing that and recognizing the savings in doing it under Medicaid rather than, you know, continuously using state funding or legislative funding going forward. So we're getting there.
Mayor Franklin, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I like Joshua, I see the big opportunity is in transport billing and being able to do, because it's a need and something that we have to be able to provide to get people the stability they need. So.
And Steve, there actually is a good question that came in for you. So the question is, when it comes to implementing peers into co-response teams, there seems to be an obstacle with getting them CJIS cleared because of criminal background. And CJIS is the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services. And so the question is, do you see any way around this issue so they can be more involved with the co-response teams?
We do, and we fight it. And when we get those reports that come in that said these persons were incarcerated for whatever years, and we see the case histories of the individual, we will work with the state in our responses. We want to hire this person anyway because of that experience, because of the value they bring to our teams. And so far, we've been very fortunate in being able to do that and moving forward. And we've hired some, what people would think were pretty rough people, but they are the most amazing staff you could hire that engage incredibly. So it's a battle, but I think it's worth it.
I'm looking to synthesize. I think we have time for one more question that I think I can direct to all of you and can kind of use that as a wrap up and close out. So what do you all see as the pros and cons of co-response for mental health crises as compared to independent teams that aren't embedded in a police department, fire department, or EMS, such as the Minneapolis Behavioral Crisis Response Team?
So the pros and cons of both models, is that what the question was?
And is the question about it, I'm so sorry, is the question about them being part of like the city infrastructure, or just the idea of that the response does not involve police?
And so it's asking more, so how can this be an independent team or a standalone team versus a team within a police department or a fire department or EMS?
So maybe one of my colleagues on the Zoom can answer this better, because we're just starting our independent model. It's been embedded in police, embedded in fire, embedded in our library now. But the challenge, I think, is, 911 is county-wide. So we have funding to do something at a city level. And then it just gets a little bit complicated. So having them embedded, kind of helps us get them out. When there's a 911 call, they do go out with others, but the goal will be to have it independent. And I think the real benefit of that is it keeps those 911 responses, it keeps our police or fire going to the urgent calls that are better suited for them. So I want my police officers going out when somebody is being, being chased with a knife, if there's gun violence. That's where I want my police officers focused. I want my firefighters focused where there's putting out fires or saving somebody from a heart attack or whatever. But all of these teams right now are being brought into behavioral health crises, and they're doing a great job, but it's so much more effective will be our alternative response independent. Sometimes they may need police or fire with them because of the health emergency that they're having, or maybe there's a safety emergency together with the behavioral health crisis. But if we can send a team on their own, it really allows those resources, which are getting scarcer and scarcer. Staffing is hard in all departments right now, not just police, not just fire, not just alt response, all of them. And then we have more people available to respond to the variety of needs our community has. So I think it's a win. And in the meantime, I think co-response helps kind of normalize this. It's normal to send social workers. It's normal. And I think it's always the first step in helping your community understand how this is going to work.
Yeah, I'd jump in there, and I agree with what Mayor Franklin said on the last part about normalization. One of the things that's really important about this work is helping, the sort of default responders in these cities to kind of recognize that, like, they don't actually have to take a lot of these calls, and in fact, in many places, law enforcement can end up being one of the #1 promoter of these programs. Oh, great! I don't have to do that. That actually sounds fantastic. And so that can be a major help. There are some downsides, right? We talked earlier about culture. If you have a program that's embedded in a police department or in a fire department, those places have their own very particular cultures, and there are parts of that culture that I think that we generally don't want to see end up showing up as being at the heart of a lot of these alternative response programs. For example, even the way in which you know, a lot of police departments, there is you know, in a lot of places you'll hear them say your number one job is to get home at the end of the night. And so there is this sort of sitting in the background of everything is this sort of everyone can be dangerous. I need to approach every situation with my head on a swivel. And that sort of approach, I've talked to program leaders who have said that can start to infect our, you know, our responders, right? Who are, you know, talking about you know, feeling like they want to wear bulletproof vests now. And actually we need to get trained on weapons and tasers. And should we carry guns too, actually? Right? Like that sort of a thing can build over time. And, you know, I think that that's a major downside. And when you have them separate, you can have the culture sort of develop where alternative responders can sort of recognize I don't need to necessarily be an inherently escalating force in the way that police sometimes can be, right? You show up to a situation with handcuffs and a gun, that may be inherently escalatory, even if you are somebody who's well trained in de-escalation, or even if you have a you know, a clinician sitting right alongside you. Yeah, I'll stop there. There's a whole lot more that can be said on that, but I'll stop there.
I think what I can add to this is that it's an evolution in progress, really, because we do not co-respond, but we work with police departments very closely, where we are embedded, or we're the additional response. When they get a call, they call my teams and we respond, you know, immediately. But I think that's where we are today in our society. You know, police and first responders have been the go-to because our behavioral health system has crumbled so badly, and it's just where we are today. But what we're finding is, it took us, let me just give you an example. In Yonkers, it took us 2 years before the police culture accepted us in the department, and now they can't get enough of us because it took that long to build that integrity and that support for the police department, where we're starting to see that shift, where they're thinking, well, maybe we don't have to be there, you know, as often as we thought we had to be there. And this mobile team is very capable of doing the job and whatever. So I think as time goes on, we're going to see more and more of this happen with mobile teams, with the co-responder teams, or whatever we have out there, where they're going to start to see the value of those teams and what they can really do, and not take the danger approach, you know, as much as we have in our behavioral health world, and really shift it. It is shifting, and so I think it'll continue to shift as long as we have good teams out there.
Thank you. And I wish we had like another 30 minutes to keep this conversation going. You all have shared so much great insight, and the questions that are coming in have been really, really, really helpful and really thoughtful. And so on behalf of President Mason and our partner organizations, I wanted to thank you as panelists for joining us and just really offering such great insight. And to our participants, I want to thank you for joining us as well this afternoon. If you have any questions, I'm sorry we weren't able to answer all of them. Please email us at reimaginepublicsafety@jjay.cuny.edu. We've dropped it into the chat right now. And in the coming days, we'll be sharing not just the recording of this conversation, we'll also be sharing any links or resources that these panelists referenced. So thank you so much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.